The fluorescent lights in this nursing home buzz like angry wasps, casting everything in that sickly yellow glow that makes even the healthiest person look like they're already dead. I suppose that's fitting for a place like this, a warehouse for the forgotten, the abandoned, the unwanted. A place where men like me come to die alone, surrounded by strangers who get paid minimum wage to pretend they care. My name is James Morrison, and I'm 78 years old. I've been a Jehovah's Witness for 60 years, an elder for 35, and a failure as a father for 43. I'm dying now. The doctors say it's pancreatic cancer, maybe 3 months left, and I find myself with nothing but time to think about all the ways I destroyed the most precious things God ever gave me. I had 3 children, Michael, Sarah, and Daniel. 2 boys and 1 girl who should have been my greatest joy, my proudest accomplishment, my legacy in this world. Instead, they became casualties of my unwavering devotion to what I believed was righteous living. They became the price I paid for what I thought was faithfulness to Jehovah. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how I ended up here, alone and full of regret, you need to understand where I came from. You need to understand my father, Harold Morrison, and how the sins of one generation echo through the next like a curse that refuses to be broken. Harold Morrison was a hard man. Not physically abusive, though his hands were quick enough when he thought discipline was needed, but emotionally distant in that way that some men of his generation wore like armor. He converted to the Jehovah's Witnesses in 1954, 2 years before I was born, and he approached his new faith with the same rigid intensity he brought to everything else. In our house, there was no Christmas, no birthdays, no flag salutes at school. There were 5 meetings a week at the Kingdom Hall, door-to-door service every Saturday morning, and Bible study every evening after dinner. My mother, Eleanor, was a gentle soul who went along with whatever Harold decided, though I sometimes caught her looking wistfully at other families during the holidays, watching them celebrate in ways we never could. Harold believed that showing affection would make me soft, that praising me would make me proud, that allowing me any freedom would lead me astray from the truth. Love, in his understanding, was demonstrated through discipline and correction, not through warmth or encouragement. I learned early that the only way to earn his approval was through perfect obedience to the organization's rules. The world is Satan's domain, he would tell me when I asked why I couldn't play with certain classmates or participate in school activities. We must be separate from it, James. We must be holy as Jehovah is holy. And when I would feel lonely or left out, he would remind me that suffering for righteousness was a privilege, that being different from the world was a badge of honor. I graduated high school with decent grades but no friends. I'd never been to a party, never had a girlfriend, never experienced the simple joys that most teenagers take for granted. Instead, I had an encyclopedic knowledge of Watchtower publications and a burning desire to prove myself worthy of the paradise I'd been promised. When I turned 18, Harold expected me to become a pioneer, a full-time minister for the organization. But something inside me rebelled. Maybe it was hormones. Maybe it was the natural human need for companionship, but I found myself drawn to a young woman in our congregation named Margaret Phillips. Margaret was 19, with auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to hold all the warmth that had been missing from my childhood. She was a good witness girl, raised in the faith, but there was something gentle about her that reminded me of my mother. When she smiled at me after meetings, I felt something I'd never experienced before. The possibility of love that wasn't conditional on my performance. We courted properly, always with chaperones, always discussing spiritual matters. But in stolen moments, we would talk about dreams and hopes, about the kind of family we wanted to have someday. Margaret spoke of children with a tenderness that made my heart ache. She talked about bedtime stories and lullabies, about birthday parties and Christmas mornings, then would catch herself and laugh nervously, saying we'd celebrate in the paradise instead. Harold disapproved of Margaret from the beginning. Not because she wasn't a good witness, her family had impeccable standing in the congregation, but because he saw how she softened me. He saw how her presence made me question things I'd never questioned before, how her dreams of a warm family life conflicted with his vision of absolute dedication to the organization. Marriage is a distraction from the preaching work, he warned me. Children are a burden that will keep you from serving Jehovah fully. Look at the Apostle Paul. He remained single so he could devote himself completely to the ministry. But I was 21 and in love, and for the first time in my life, I defied my father. Margaret and I married in a simple ceremony at the Kingdom Hall in 1977. Harold attended but didn't speak to me for 6 months afterward. The early years of our marriage were the happiest of my life. Margaret and I rented a small apartment, and I worked at a manufacturing plant while she cleaned houses part-time. We were poor but content, attending meetings together, going in service together, dreaming together about the new world that was surely just around the corner. When Margaret became pregnant with Michael in 1979, I felt a joy I didn't know was possible. Here was a chance to be the father Harold had never been, to show love and affection and create the warm family atmosphere Margaret had always dreamed of. But as Margaret's pregnancy progressed, old voices began to whisper in my head. Harold's voice, reminding me that children were distractions from spiritual things. The organization's voice, constantly emphasizing that these were the last days, that we should be focused on the preaching work rather than on building families. The elders' voices, praising the brothers who remained single or childless for the sake of the kingdom. When Michael was born, 8 pounds, 3 ounces of perfect possibility, I held him in my arms and made a fateful decision. I would raise him right. I would make sure he never strayed from the truth. I would be the spiritual head of my household that the organization demanded, even if it meant being harder on him than I wanted to be. The pattern began almost immediately. When Michael cried during meetings, I would take him to the back room for discipline. When he showed interest in toys or activities that weren't spiritual, I would redirect him to Bible stories and Watchtower publications. When he asked questions that seemed to challenge organizational teachings, I would shut them down with reminders about trusting the faithful and discreet slave. Margaret tried to balance my strictness with warmth and affection, but I gradually wore her down. Every time she wanted to indulge Michael with a special treat or activity, I would remind her of our spiritual responsibilities. Every time she expressed doubt about whether we were being too hard on him, I would quote scriptures about the need for discipline and correction. Sarah was born in 1981, and Daniel in 1983. With each child, I became more convinced that my role as a father was to be their spiritual overseer first and their loving parent second. The world was getting more dangerous, more corrupt, more hostile to true Christians. My children needed to be strong, disciplined, ready to face persecution and temptation without wavering. I instituted daily Bible studies, mandatory meeting attendance, and strict rules about association with worldly children. Birthdays were forbidden, holidays were pagan, and any expression of individualism or independence was seen as potential rebellion against Jehovah's authority. But children have a way of being children, regardless of how strictly you try to control them. Michael was naturally curious and intelligent, always asking why questions that I found threatening. Sarah was gentle and artistic, drawn to music and literature in ways that made me worry about her spiritual focus. Daniel was rebellious from birth, testing boundaries and challenging authority in ways that reminded me uncomfortably of my own brief rebellion against Harold. My response was always the same: more rules, stricter discipline, constant reminders about the importance of putting Jehovah first in everything. I convinced myself that their resistance was proof that I wasn't being firm enough, that Satan was trying to use their natural childish impulses to lead them away from the truth. As the children grew older, my control became more suffocating. I monitored their friendships, their reading material, their thoughts and dreams. I discouraged Michael's interest in science, telling him that worldly education would corrupt his faith. I forbade Sarah from participating in the school choir, explaining that it would expose her to pagan holiday music. I punished Daniel harshly for any sign of rebellion, convinced that I was saving his soul from destruction. The organization reinforced these choices at every turn. Assembly talks praised parents who kept their children spiritually strong by limiting their exposure to worldly influences. Watchtower articles warned about the dangers of higher education, competitive sports, and artistic pursuits that might distract young people from the ministry. Circuit overseers commended families like ours for our exemplary dedication to the truth. Margaret began to withdraw. I told myself it was because she was focused on supporting my spiritual leadership, but looking back, I can see that she was slowly being crushed under the weight of my rigid expectations. She stopped laughing as much, stopped sharing her dreams and hopes, stopped trying to advocate for the children when my discipline seemed too harsh. The children's responses to my control varied. Michael became sullen and withdrawn, spending more and more time alone in his room with his books and his thoughts. Sarah tried desperately to please me, becoming the perfect little witness girl who commented at meetings and auxiliary pioneered during summer breaks. Daniel openly rebelled, refusing to participate in family studies and making it clear that he hated everything about our religion. I responded to their different reactions in the only way I knew how, with more rules, more discipline, more attempts to force them into the mold of perfect witness children. I told myself that I was protecting them from a world that would destroy them, that my strictness was an expression of love rather than control. But the truth was, I was repeating the same patterns my father had established. I was raising my children with the same emotional distance, the same conditional love, the same rigid expectations that had shaped my own childhood. The cycle of spiritual abuse was continuing, and I was too blind to see it. The first real crisis came when Michael turned 16. He'd always been a good student, and his guidance counselor recommended him for advanced placement classes that could lead to college scholarships. When he brought the papers home for me to sign, I threw them in the trash. "College is a waste of time," I told him. "The end of this system is close. You need to be focusing on spiritual goals, not worldly achievements." For the first time in his life, Michael stood up to me. "What if you're wrong?" he asked quietly. "What if the end doesn't come, and I've wasted my whole life preparing for something that never happens?" I was so shocked by his question that I slapped him. Hard. Across the face, the way Harold had slapped me when I dared to question organizational teachings. "Don't you ever speak against Jehovah's organization in this house," I warned him. "Everything we have, everything we are, comes from the truth. Without it, we're nothing." Michael looked at me with something I'd never seen in his eyes before. Not fear, not respect, but pity. He touched his reddening cheek and said, "I feel sorry for you, Dad. I really do." That night, Margaret came to me in tears. "James, we're losing him," she whispered. "Can't you see that we're pushing him away?" But I was too proud, too convinced of my righteousness, to admit that anything was wrong. "He'll come around," I told her. "This is just a phase. The truth will win out in the end." Sarah's rebellion was quieter but no less devastating. At 17, she confessed to me that she'd been dating a boy from school, a worldly boy who wasn't one of Jehovah's Witnesses. When I demanded that she stop seeing him immediately, she refused. "He's kind to me, Dad," she said, and there was something in her voice that broke my heart even as it infuriated me. "He listens to me. He thinks my dreams matter." I threatened to disfellowship her myself if she continued the relationship. I told her she was throwing away her chance at eternal life for temporary pleasures. I reminded her of all the young witness men who would make suitable husbands if she would just be patient and trust in Jehovah's timing. But Sarah had inherited Margaret's gentle stubbornness. She continued seeing the boy, and when I followed through on my threat to have her disfellowshipped, she accepted it with a sadness that haunts me still. "I love you, Daddy," she said the night before her judicial committee meeting. "But I can't live in a world where love has so many conditions attached to it." Margaret's death in 1995 marked the beginning of the end for our family. She'd been battling breast cancer for 2 years, and the stress of watching our children drift away from the organization had weakened her already fragile health. In her final weeks, she begged me to reconcile with Sarah, to show Michael more understanding, to find some way to bridge the growing chasm between Daniel and me. "Please, James," she whispered from her hospital bed. "Don't let your pride destroy what's left of our family. The children need their father, and you need them." But even then, even as I watched the woman I loved slip away from me, I couldn't let go of my rigid beliefs about spiritual headship and organizational loyalty. I told her that the children had made their choices, that I couldn't compromise the truth for the sake of family unity. Margaret died on a Tuesday morning in March, and at her funeral, I stood before our congregation and praised her faithfulness to Jehovah. I talked about how she'd supported my spiritual leadership, how she'd been a model witness wife and mother. But I couldn't bring myself to acknowledge the price she'd paid for that faithfulness, or the ways my inflexibility had contributed to her suffering. Michael was 19 then, working at a garage and living in a rented room across town. He came to the funeral but sat in the back, wearing a suit I'd never seen before and holding himself with a dignity that reminded me painfully of his mother. After the service, he approached me briefly. "I'm sorry for your loss, Dad," he said formally. "Mom was a good woman. She deserved better than what she got from this family." Sarah was 22 and still disfellowshipped. According to organizational rules, I wasn't supposed to acknowledge her presence at the funeral, but when I saw her standing by Margaret's casket with tears streaming down her face, something inside me cracked. Just for a moment, I wanted to run to her, to hold her, to tell her that nothing mattered more than having her back in my life. But the eyes of the congregation were on me, and I couldn't allow myself to show weakness. I turned away from my daughter and accepted the condolences of my fellow elders, playing the role of the faithful widower who trusted in Jehovah's wisdom even in his grief. Daniel was 15 and still living at home, but Margaret's death seemed to break whatever connection we'd had left. He became even more rebellious, staying out late, associating with worldly friends, making it clear that he blamed me for his mother's unhappiness and early death. "She died of a broken heart," he told me one night after I tried to counsel him about his behavior. "You killed her just as surely as if you'd put a gun to her head." I wanted to argue with him, to defend myself, to explain that everything I'd done had been out of love and concern for our eternal welfare. But the words stuck in my throat, because part of me wondered if he might be right. The next 15 years passed in a blur of increasing isolation and growing regret. Michael moved to another state, got married to a woman I'd never met, and had children whose names I didn't know. Occasionally, I would get updates through mutual acquaintances. He'd started his own business, bought a house, seemed to be building the kind of life I'd always discouraged him from wanting. Sarah eventually moved back to town and tried to reconnect with me. She would call occasionally, inviting me to lunch or asking if I wanted to meet her children. 2 beautiful grandchildren I'd never held. But I was still bound by organizational rules about associating with disfellowshipped family members, still convinced that maintaining those boundaries was necessary for her spiritual welfare. "I keep hoping you'll choose your family over your religion," she said during one of our brief, painful phone conversations. "But I'm starting to realize that's never going to happen." Daniel left home the day he turned 18 and never looked back. He joined the military, something that was strictly forbidden for Jehovah's Witnesses, and I didn't speak to him for 3 years. When he finally called to tell me he was getting married, I hung up on him rather than listen to what I considered his apostasy. I threw myself into organizational activities with renewed fervor, telling myself that I was storing up treasures in heaven while my contemporaries were wasting their time on worldly family relationships. I became known in our circuit as a spiritual strongman, someone who put kingdom interests above personal feelings, someone who could be counted on to uphold organizational standards no matter the cost. But late at night, alone in the house that had once been filled with children's laughter, I would sometimes allow myself to wonder what I'd lost in my pursuit of spiritual excellence. I would look at Margaret's picture and remember the dreams she'd shared with me in our early years. Dreams of birthday parties and Christmas mornings, of watching our children grow up happy and confident and loved. The doubts would come in waves, usually triggered by some small thing, a greeting card from Sarah that I would throw away unread, a glimpse of Michael's family at a distance in the grocery store, a news report about Daniel's military unit that would make my heart race with worry I refused to acknowledge. But I always pushed the doubts away, reminding myself that faithfulness to Jehovah required sacrifice, that Abraham had been willing to offer up Isaac, that Jesus had said his followers would face division within their own families. I convinced myself that my pain was proof of my righteousness, that the cost I was paying was evidence of my spiritual maturity. My world began to collapse in earnest when I turned 75. I'd been feeling unwell for months. Fatigue, weight loss, abdominal pain. But I'd attributed it to age and stress. When the diagnosis of pancreatic cancer came, the doctors told me I had maybe 2 years to live with treatment, 6 months without it. I chose treatment, partly out of hope and partly out of fear, but the chemotherapy left me weak and nauseated, unable to maintain the level of organizational activity that had defined my identity for so long. I had to step down from my position as an elder, had to stop participating in the door-to-door work that had been my primary source of purpose. For the first time in decades, I was forced to slow down, to sit quietly with my thoughts, to confront the reality of what my life had become. I was 75 years old, dying of cancer, and utterly alone. The brothers from the congregation would visit occasionally, offering prayers and encouragement, but I could see in their eyes that they viewed me as a cautionary tale. What happened when you outlived your usefulness to the organization? The financial reality was harsh as well. I'd never saved much money, convinced that the end of the world would come before I needed a retirement fund. The house needed repairs I couldn't afford, and my medical bills were mounting faster than my insurance could cover them. When I could no longer care for myself, there was only one option: a nursing home. None of my children offered to take me in. Why would they? I'd spent their entire lives pushing them away, choosing organizational loyalty over family love, treating them as projects to be managed rather than people to be cherished. The day I moved into Sunset Manor, I sat in my small, sterile room and finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I'd lost. 60 years of faithful service to an organization that discarded me the moment I became inconvenient. 3 children who might mourn my death but would never miss my presence in their lives. A legacy of broken relationships and missed opportunities that could never be repaired. It was in this place of utter desolation that I met Henry Williams, my roommate at the nursing home. Henry was 83, a retired Methodist minister who'd spent 50 years serving small congregations throughout the Midwest. His children visited regularly, his grandchildren called him weekly, and his room was filled with pictures and mementos from a life well lived. At first, I resented Henry's obvious contentment. Here was a man who'd rejected the truth as I understood it, who'd spent his life teaching false doctrine, and yet he seemed to have everything I'd sacrificed in my pursuit of righteousness. It seemed unfair, cosmic evidence that Jehovah's justice was sometimes hard to understand. But Henry was kind to me in ways I didn't deserve. When I was too weak to feed myself, he would help me with my meals. When I had nightmares about my children, he would sit by my bed and listen to my rambling confessions. When I was bitter and angry about my circumstances, he would offer gentle wisdom that slowly began to penetrate my hardened heart. "Tell me about your family, James," he said one evening as we sat in the common room watching the sunset through the windows. I started to give him my usual response, that my children had chosen the world over the truth, that they'd rejected the spiritual guidance I tried to provide, that their absence from my life was their own fault. But something in Henry's patient, loving expression stopped me. Instead, I found myself telling him the real story. About Michael's questions that I'd silenced with slaps and scripture. About Sarah's gentle rebellion that I'd met with disfellowshipping and rejection. About Daniel's anger that I'd answered with more anger, more control, more religious rigidity. Henry listened without judgment, occasionally asking gentle questions that helped me see patterns I'd never recognized before. When I finished my story, he was quiet for a long time. "James," he finally said, "can I ask you something? When you think about Jesus, not the organization's teachings about him, but Jesus himself, how do you think he would have treated your children?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I'd spent 60 years studying the Bible, teaching others about Jesus' example, but I'd never really considered what that example might mean for my own parenting. "Jesus loved children," Henry continued gently. "He welcomed them, blessed them, used them as examples of the kind of faith we should all have. He criticized the religious leaders who put rules above relationships, who cared more about appearances than about people's hearts." Over the following weeks, Henry began to show me scriptures I'd read hundreds of times but never really understood. Passages about God's patience and mercy, about love being the greatest commandment, about how people would know we were Christians by our love for one another. "The Pharisees were very concerned about following rules," Henry observed one day. "They tithed their mint and cumin, they kept the Sabbath strictly, they maintained their ritual purity. But Jesus said they'd missed the weightier matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness." I wanted to argue with him, to defend the organizational structure I'd served so faithfully. But something inside me was beginning to crack, like ice breaking up in spring. For the first time in decades, I was hearing the gospel not as a set of rules to be followed, but as a message of love to be lived. It took me 3 months to write the letter. 3 months of starting and stopping, of crumpling up pages and beginning again, of wrestling with pride and fear and the terrible weight of 60 years of mistakes. Henry helped me, not by telling me what to write, but by reminding me of what I'd learned about grace and forgiveness and the kind of love that doesn't keep a record of wrongs. He would sit beside my bed as I worked, sometimes reading passages from his worn Bible, sometimes just providing the quiet presence I needed to keep going. The hardest part was admitting that I'd been wrong. Not just mistaken, not just overly strict, but fundamentally wrong about what it meant to be a father, a husband, a follower of Christ. I'd confused religious performance with spiritual maturity, organizational loyalty with faithfulness to God, control with love. I wrote separate letters to each of my children, acknowledging the specific ways I'd failed them, asking for forgiveness I knew I didn't deserve. To Michael, I apologized for silencing his questions and discouraging his dreams. To Sarah, I expressed regret for choosing organizational rules over relationship with her. To Daniel, I acknowledged that my anger and rigidity had driven him away from both me and from faith itself. But I also wrote a general letter, one that Henry suggested I send to all three of them, explaining the journey I'd taken to understand my failures and the peace I'd found in finally grasping what Jesus' love really meant. Here is that letter. My dear children, I am dying, and I know that news will bring you neither surprise nor sorrow. I have been a stranger to you for so long that my death will be merely the formal end of a relationship that ceased to exist years ago. But before I go, I need to tell you some things, not because I expect forgiveness or reconciliation, but because the truth needs to be spoken, even if it comes too late to matter. I failed you. Not as a provider. I always made sure you had food and shelter and clothing. Not as a teacher. I made sure you knew every scripture, every organizational procedure, every rule and regulation that governed our religious life. I failed you as a father, as a human being, as someone who was supposed to show you what love looked like. I confused control with care, rules with righteousness, fear with faith. I was so concerned with molding you into perfect Jehovah's Witnesses that I forgot to love you as the unique, precious individuals God created you to be. I treated you as projects to be managed rather than people to be cherished. Michael, I see now how I crushed your natural curiosity and intelligence in my fear that questions would lead to apostasy. You had a brilliant mind that I should have encouraged and celebrated. Instead, I silenced your wondering, discouraged your dreams, and robbed you of the educational opportunities that could have enriched your life. Your mother tried to tell me that your questions came from a seeking heart, not a rebellious one, but I was too proud and frightened to listen. Sarah, my precious daughter, I am so sorry for the way I rejected you when you chose love over organizational loyalty. You were trying to tell me that your heart was starving for the kind of unconditional acceptance that only a father should provide, but I was so concerned with maintaining my reputation in the congregation that I sacrificed our relationship on the altar of religious appearance. You deserved a father who would fight for you, not one who would discard you for the sake of organizational rules. Daniel, my son, I know you blame me for your mother's death, and I've come to realize that you're not entirely wrong. I did break her heart with my rigidity and coldness. She begged me, especially in her final years, to choose love over law, to embrace our family instead of pushing you all away. But I was too stubborn, too convinced of my own righteousness, to hear her wisdom. Your anger toward me was justified, and I'm sorry I met it with more anger instead of the understanding you needed. I want you to know that your mother loved you more than life itself. Every harsh word I spoke, every rule I enforced, every punishment I administered caused her pain. She tried to balance my coldness with warmth, my rigidity with grace, but I gradually wore her down until she felt trapped between her love for you and her loyalty to me. In the end, she died feeling like she'd failed you all, when the truth is that I failed her. I need you to understand something else. The way I treated you had nothing to do with your worth as human beings and everything to do with my own brokenness. My father, your grandfather Harold, raised me with the same cold discipline, the same conditional love, the same religious rigidity that I inflicted on you. I told myself I was breaking the cycle, but instead I perpetuated it. I became the very thing I should have worked hardest to avoid. For 60 years, I served an organization that I believed represented God's will on earth. I put loyalty to human leaders above love for my own family. I confused their rules with God's heart, their approval with divine blessing. I realize now that I made an idol of the Watchtower organization, and I sacrificed the most precious things in my life, you, on that idol's altar. A wise man here at the nursing home has been showing me what Jesus' love actually looks like. Not the harsh, demanding, conditional love I learned from my father and taught to you, but the patient, accepting, grace-filled love that sees beyond our failures to our hearts. Jesus welcomed children, blessed them, used them as examples of pure faith. He criticized religious leaders who put rules above relationships, who cared more about appearing righteous than about showing mercy. If Jesus had been your father, he would have encouraged Michael's questions and celebrated his intellect. He would have fought for Sarah when the elders wanted to disfellowship her, choosing relationship over religious politics. He would have shown Daniel that authority exercised in love looks nothing like the harsh control I mistook for spiritual leadership. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it, and I know the wounds I've inflicted run too deep to be healed by one letter from a dying old man. But I want you to know that I see my failures clearly now, and I am deeply, profoundly sorry for the pain I caused you. I want you to know that you were not the problem. You were never the problem. You were beautiful children who deserved better than what I gave you. Michael, your questions were not signs of weakness but evidence of a seeking heart. Sarah, your desire for love and acceptance was not selfish but deeply human and completely understandable. Daniel, your anger was not rebellion but a natural response to feeling rejected and controlled. I want you to know that despite everything I did wrong, I loved you. I loved you in the only broken way I knew how, filtered through fear and religion and the damage that had been done to me. But love without grace is not really love at all. It's just expectation wearing a disguise. I wish I had learned that lesson in time to be the father you needed. If there are grandchildren I've never met, please tell them about their grandmother Margaret. Tell them she was kind and gentle and full of dreams about the family she wanted us to be. Tell them she loved music and laughter and all the simple joys I was too rigid to allow. Don't tell them much about me. There's little in my story that would benefit them. But help them understand that their grandmother deserved better than the life she got. I'm not asking you to visit me or to suddenly pretend that we have a relationship worth preserving. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, though I would treasure it if you could find it in your hearts to give it someday. I'm just asking you to know that I finally understand what I lost, and I am sorry beyond words. Live freely. Love deeply. Raise your children with the warmth and acceptance I failed to give you. Break the cycle that has poisoned our family for 2 generations. Don't let my failures define your understanding of what family should be. And if you ever think of me, try to remember that in the end, I finally learned what love was supposed to look like. It just came too late to save us. Your father, James Morrison. The final days. I sent the letters on a Tuesday in November, 3 months before my death. Henry helped me address the envelopes and walked with me to the nursing home's mailbox, his old hand steady on my shaking arm as I dropped them in. What do you think they'll do? I asked him as we made our way slowly back to our room. I don't know, Henry replied honestly. But you've done what you could. You've spoken the truth, asked for forgiveness, and acknowledged your failures. The rest is up to them and to God. I waited for responses that never came. Part of me had hoped that my confession might open a door to reconciliation, that my children might visit or call or at least acknowledge my letters. But as the weeks passed in silence, I came to understand that this too was a consequence I had to accept. The damage I'd done was too deep, too fundamental, to be repaired by one letter, no matter how heartfelt. My children had built lives without me, had learned to function without a father's love, had made peace with my absence in ways that made my presence unnecessary now. But strangely, I found peace in that realization. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't trying to control an outcome or manipulate a situation to serve my own needs. I had spoken the truth, asked for forgiveness, and acknowledged my failures. Whether my children responded or not, I had finally done what a father should do. I had taken responsibility for my mistakes. Henry and I spent my final weeks talking about grace, about the kind of love that doesn't keep score, about the God who sees beyond our failures to our hearts. He would read to me from the Gospels, helping me see Jesus not as the harsh judge I'd imagined, but as the loving Savior who came to heal the brokenhearted and set the captives free. Do you think God will forgive me? I asked him one evening as my strength was failing. James, Henry said gently, God forgave you before you even asked. The question is whether you can forgive yourself. That was the hardest part. Learning to accept grace that I knew I didn't deserve, learning to believe that my failures weren't the final word on my worth as a human being. But gradually, in those final days, I began to understand what the gospel really meant. Not a system of rules to be followed perfectly, but a message of love that meets us in our brokenness and makes us whole. I died on a Thursday morning in February, with Henry holding my hand and reading from the 23rd Psalm. The funeral was small, a few brothers from the congregation, some staff from the nursing home, and Henry, who insisted on speaking about the man I'd become in my final months rather than the man I'd been for most of my life. My children didn't come. I hadn't expected them to, but Henry told me later that he'd seen a woman with auburn hair, so much like Margaret's, standing at the back of the cemetery during the burial. She didn't approach the grave, didn't speak to anyone, but she stayed until the last shovel of dirt was thrown. Sarah, perhaps, saying goodbye in the only way she could manage. Epilogue. What I learned too late. If I could speak to every father reading this story, every parent who thinks that religious rules matter more than relationships, every person who has confused organizational loyalty with faithfulness to God, here's what I would tell you. Your children are not projects to be managed or problems to be solved. They are human beings created in God's image, deserving of unconditional love, acceptance, and support. Your job as a parent is not to force them into a predetermined mold, but to help them discover who God created them to be. Questions are not threats to faith. They are evidence of thinking minds seeking truth. When your children ask difficult questions about religion, about life, about your beliefs, don't silence them with scripture or shame them with accusations of faithlessness. Engage with their questions honestly, admit when you don't know something, and trust that a faith that can't withstand scrutiny isn't worth having anyway. Love is not conditional performance. Real love, the kind that reflects God's heart, doesn't keep score, doesn't withdraw when someone disappoints you, doesn't demand perfect compliance in exchange for acceptance. If your love for your children depends on their religious choices, their career decisions, or their personal relationships, then what you're offering isn't love at all. It's emotional manipulation. Religious organizations are human institutions, not divine ones. They can provide community, structure, and guidance, but they are not God, and their rules are not necessarily God's will. When organizational loyalty conflicts with family love, when religious rules demand that you reject your own children, when spiritual leaders counsel you to choose their approval over your children's welfare, that's when you need to remember that Jesus criticized religious leaders who put rules above relationships. The greatest commandments are to love God and love others. Everything else, every rule, every regulation, every organizational policy, must be measured against those commandments. If your religious practice is making you less loving, less patient, less gracious, less kind, then you're doing it wrong, regardless of what your leaders tell you. Your children will remember how you made them feel long after they've forgotten what you taught them. They'll remember whether you listened to their concerns or dismissed them. They'll remember whether you celebrated their uniqueness or tried to suppress it. They'll remember whether your love felt safe and unconditional or demanding and performance-based. It's never too late to change, until it is. I learned these lessons in my final months, when my children were grown and gone and the damage was irreversible. Don't wait until you're dying in a nursing home to understand what really matters. Don't let pride and religious rigidity cost you the most precious relationships in your life. And if you're reading this as someone who grew up with a parent like me, someone whose love felt conditional, whose approval you could never quite earn, whose religious priorities always seemed to matter more than your heart, please know that their failures were not your fault. You deserved better than you got. You deserved unconditional love, patient guidance, and celebration of who you were created to be. Don't let the damage done to you become damage you pass on to others. Break the cycle. Choose love over law, relationships over rules, grace over judgment. Be the parent you needed when you were young. As I write these final words from whatever place the dead go to observe the living, I watch my children and grandchildren building lives filled with the warmth and love that was missing from our home. Michael became an engineer, just as his curious mind always suggested he would. He and his wife Rebecca have raised 2 children with patience and encouragement, answering their questions and supporting their dreams in ways I never learned to do. Sarah eventually remarried a kind man named David who accepted her past and helped her heal from the wounds of rejection and conditional love. Their 3 children know they are treasured for who they are, not for how well they perform religious duties. Sarah kept something of her faith. She attends a small community church where questions are welcome and love is freely given, but she rejected the harsh legalism that poisoned her childhood. Daniel never returned to organized religion, but he became a man of deep integrity and compassion. His military service taught him about sacrifice and brotherhood, and he now works with veterans struggling with trauma and addiction. He married Maria, a social worker, and they've adopted 4 children from difficult backgrounds, giving them the unconditional acceptance and support that Daniel himself never received. None of my children speak my name with fondness, but they've all chosen to be different from me in their own parenting. They've broken the cycle of conditional love and religious rigidity that plagued our family for 2 generations. In that way, perhaps my failures served a purpose. They showed my children exactly what kind of parent they didn't want to be. Henry was right about grace. God's love is not like human love. It doesn't depend on our performance, doesn't withdraw when we fail, doesn't keep a record of our mistakes. But it took me 78 years and the perspective of approaching death to understand that truth, and by then it was too late to live it out in the relationships that mattered most. If there's mercy beyond this life, and I believe there is, perhaps I'll have the chance to tell Margaret how sorry I am for the life I gave her instead of the one she dreamed of. Perhaps I'll be able to embrace the children I pushed away, to love them the way I should have from the beginning. But for now, from this place between time and eternity, I offer this story as a warning and a plea. Don't choose religious rules over family relationships. Don't let organizational loyalty cost you the love of your children. Don't mistake control for care, performance for love, or fear for faith. Love deeply, forgive quickly, and remember that in the end, the only thing that really matters is how well we love the people God placed in our lives. Everything else, every meeting attended, every hour of service logged, every organizational requirement fulfilled, means nothing if we lose the hearts of those who should have mattered most. I chose the Watchtower over my children, and I died alone because of that choice. Don't make my mistake. Choose love. Choose family. Choose grace. Choose differently than I did, while you still can. James Morrison, February 2018. Author's note: this story is fiction, but it reflects the real experiences of many families torn apart by religious extremism and conditional love. If you recognize yourself in James's story, either as a parent whose religious rigidity is damaging your relationships, or as a child who grew up feeling that love was something to be earned rather than freely given, please know that it's never too late to choose love over law, grace over judgment, relationship over rules. The greatest tragedy is not that we make mistakes as parents, but that pride prevents us from acknowledging those mistakes and working to repair the damage we've done. Love requires humility, and humility requires admitting when we've been wrong. Choose love. Choose family. Choose grace. Choose differently while you still can.